From Arab Spring optimism to a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. It began as a revolution that plunged the country into civil war. 11 years after the start of an uprising that led to President Ali Abdullah Saleh's overthrow, are any Yemenis better off? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the anniversary of the uprising in Yemen. In 2011, when pro-democracy protests spread across the Arab world, Yemen was one of the first countries to experience a people's uprising. Thousands protested in the capital Sana'a and other cities, but it would take a year for President Ali Abdullah Saleh to relinquish power. Saleh's deputy, Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, inherited a political crisis which he failed to get under control. And as divisions and unrest grew, the Shia Houthi movement seized control of their home province in the north. And by the beginning of 2015, they had taken control of Yemen's capital, Sana'a. Saudi Arabia and regional Sunni powers sought to counter the Iran-backed Houthis. Aided by the US, the UK, and France, they launched an air offensive. Now, the war that the Saudis believed would last just a few weeks is now in its 7th year. The human cost of the crisis has been devastating. UNICEF estimates that around 21 million people are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. More than 11 million of them are children. Most kids under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition, and hundreds of thousands could die if they don't receive urgent treatment. The UN says Yemen has become a living hell for its children. Now, the continuing conflict and economic decline have formed a perfect storm. An estimated 80% of the population depends on international aid organizations for food and health care. The UN warns that most of the population doesn't have access to basics, including clean drinking water or medical assistance.
And this is my primary concern. It's not just the immediate humanitarian suffering that one sees, but the gradual deterioration in the country. And the longer this conflict drags on, the deeper that will go. And at a certain point in time, and I've had my own experience in other countries where this type of conflict has continued for 20, 25 years, it results in a totally transformed country. One in which you have 1 or 2 generations of young people who've not known peace, who've not known access to good education, who've had to find ways to survive and help their families survive. It's not the life that we want for anyone.
So with so much desperation in Yemen and no resolution in sight, where do the dreams of those 2011 protesters stand today? Joining me now from London to discuss that is Elisabeth Kendall. She's a senior research fellow in Oriental Studies at Pembroke College, Oxford, and has also been involved in educational projects in Yemen. Marwan Kabalan is the Director of Policy Analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha. And Giorgio Cafiero joins us from Washington. He is the founder and CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consultancy focusing on the Middle East. Thanks all so much for being with us. Elisabeth, you know, the sad reality here is that so many Yemenis 11 years ago risked their lives to protest and to fight for something better, to end corruption and to just get the dignity that, you know, we all deserve. And now they've ended up with something unimaginably really worse. Still, was it worth fighting for? Did they have to at least try?
Well, you've articulated the situation really well there. Was it worth it, given what you've just said? I think we have to go back to the fact that Yemenis really needed change. They wanted change. And this uprising 11 years ago, it wasn't just a knock-on effect of what happened in Tunisia or Egypt. There had been regional protests around Yemen throughout the 2000s. They were ready for change. Their hopes were high, and they deserved it. But look at where we are now. 7 years of war. It's really hard to say it was worth it. We've got over 25,000 coalition air raids that have happened over Yemen. It's a country where about 80% of the population need aid, 16 million are starving, it's polarized, the country's fragmenting, the infrastructure's in ruins, there's economic collapse. It's very hard to say it's worth it. And I'll just finish off by saying I do think that some blame also needs to attach to the international community, not just the regional actors now involved in Yemen, because we spent 3 decades propping up a dictatorship in Yemen. We were busy building a strong man rather than helping to build robust institutions. That was always going to boil over at some point when people could no longer put up with it.
Right.
So I think we need to learn some lessons.
Elisabeth, though, I mean, how far back have these last 7 years actually set the country? Because you actually said even if the war ended tomorrow, which is impossible, it would still take decades to just recover from the last 7 years.
It would. Now, it's true that Yemen was already in a very difficult economic situation before the war began, but this has massively exacerbated it. And you think about it, we have a whole lost generation now. Even if all the aid and the funding came in to help rebuild the country, who's going to do it? We have 4 million people inside Yemen who are internally displaced. How do the kids go to school? Around 230 schools have been bombed. So, and imagine it, it's 7 years of war, but it's about 17 years of war for those in the Houthi areas. War has become a way of life. We have a lost generation, uneducated, malnourished, and traumatized.
Okay. Giorgio, let me ask you, I mean, is it that bad? Is your outlook now any more optimistic than Elisabeth's?
No, I think anyone who's being realistic about the situation in Yemen has a very pessimistic outlook. These humanitarian disasters have just been getting worse and worse. And I completely agree that we can't put all the blame on the doorstep of people in Yemen or regional countries. The international community deserves a lot of blame for what has unfolded in Yemen. And unfortunately, I think we have, an international community that has stopped paying so much attention to Yemen. I think there never was enough attention paid to Yemen, but it's definitely decreased. It's been something that people have talked about for years, but there's sort of people have been desensitized somewhat to events in Yemen. There's fatigue from donors, and all of this is just making matters worse. Right now in early 2022, as the war is not winding down, it's only escalating further. And unfortunately, these humanitarian disasters are set to probably exacerbate this year, and it's beyond tragic.
You know, you would hope that looking at examples of the past when there's been similar levels of devastation, perhaps arguably World War II, when we saw massive destruction across parts of Europe, still within a decade, these countries had been, in large part, rebuilt. And particularly in Western Europe, societies were able to start over. Marwan, let me ask you, could that ever be the case with a country like Yemen, where if there is investment and funding from arguably the countries that are in part responsible for some of this destruction, could Yemen rebuild on similar lines?
Let me first remind you that when the Yemen revolution started in 2011, it started in a very spontaneous way, just like every other revolution in the Arab West, starting from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Syria. But then you can't decide actually where this revolution would end, especially when we live in such a region in which we have 2 key factors that we should look at in order to understand why actually the revolution in Yemen ended where it is right now, which is no longer a revolution, because in my opinion, the revolution actually ended in 2014 when the Houthis took over Sana'a, and then the Saudis decided to retaliate by starting this war. The 2 factors that I'm talking about right here is that we live in a rivalry context. When you have a revolution taking place in a rivalry regional context, it's more likely actually to end up in a war by proxy, in which all countries, I mean the surrounding countries, the neighboring countries, would intervene in some way or another, in either to support the status quo or to support change, where every country would do exactly the same, but or different things in the same revolution. Like, for example, the Iranians in Syria are supporting the status quo, supporting Bashar al-Assad, whereas the Saudis are supporting change. In Yemen, they were supporting Ali Abdullah Saleh, the status quo, whereas the Iranians are supporting change, when in this case, the Houthis. So we have this rivalry context which have turned not only Yemen, almost every other revolution in the Arab world into a war by proxy. Libya, Syria, of course, I mean, you name them.
Right.
The second factor that we need really to look at, because that explains a lot here in the case of Yemen, is that we have a very divided societies, sectarian, tribal societies, and they are actually looking for external support in order to knock out their local rivals. So the Houthis, they are seeking help from Iran, and the other people, the government, the legitimate government, the so-called legitimate government of Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, is supporting the backing of the Saudis and the Emiratis. So these two factors are very important in order to understand the whole situation, not only in Yemen, but throughout the Arab world.
Absolutely. Elisabeth, though, I mean, as for Yemen right now, will we ever get to a point then where Yemenis can talk to Yemenis, hopefully without the interference and or guidance of foreign powers? Because many are arguing that is essentially what needs to happen in order for Yemen to find peace. Yemenis have to talk to Yemenis.
I think that's incredibly important. This isn't a conflict that was generated externally. It was generated ultimately domestically over decades ago. And so ultimately it does need to be solved domestically. That's really difficult when you have so many foreign actors with their ambitions inside Yemen, helping the different sides. So one thing that the international community could really do better is to try to peel away all of those international layers to the conflict so that it can clear the way for Yemenis to start to speak to each other and solve their own problems. Now, Marwan made a very important point also when he said that the Yemeni society is so fragmented. It's really important that the talks that happen in Yemen between Yemenis are properly inclusive and not just a question of perceiving stakeholders to be those who shout the loudest or who have the guns. Because actually, Yemeni society is awash with guns. You shouldn't have to force people to use them in order to get their voices to be heard. All of the outlying regions need to be included. And of course, there needs to be great representation of the youth populations and of women, not just as tick box exercises, but genuinely inclusive mechanisms. And then maybe there'll be some buy-in on the ground for any agreements that are actually made, rather than having the same old elites come to conclusions amongst themselves and never be able to translate this into peace on the ground.
Right. You stressed the maybe there, Elisabeth, because some are really saying that these kinds of talks, these inclusive angles, just aren't feasible. They're not realistic. Too much damage has been done. The only president that they've had since the uprising began was Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, whom many feel is just a more polarizing figure rather than a unifying figure, obviously. So how much at this point now is partition an option? Because while there used to be a semblance of one national cause, there are now so many regional dimensions that many see as just irreconcilable.
I'm not sure that the partition argument works for all Yemenis, because in fact, Yemen is more than just two parts. I would think that a federal solution might be a better one. But I mean, you're right in that it's going to be a massive challenge, but I don't think that one can be defeatist. What needs to happen is that mechanisms need to be put in place to help find true representation, and that is not an expedient short-term solution. The problem is that the international community always wants a solution tomorrow, but solutions take time, and we do need to start now. Yemenis are a really smart race. They have aspirations, hopes, they have energy and willpower. It needs to be harnessed and not just left to the same old elites.
Okay. Giorgio, let's go back to the role of the international community here. You know, U.S. policy in particular was sometimes cited as kind of being at fault, not least under the Trump administration. The Houthis were designated a terrorist organization. Biden reversed that. Still, though, could the U.S. and the U.K. as well, for example, have done more to prevent the tragedy that Yemen is today? And is there something they can do now to reconcile their past role?
Yes, I definitely do hold the U.S. and the U.K. In no small part accountable for problems, responsible for problems in Yemen. I think, to be frank, both of these countries have seen the crises in Yemen as an opportunity to, benefit from arms sales to Saudi Arabia and other GCC states. When Trump was president, he was very open, very cavalier about that in terms of how he talked about these huge arms sales to Saudi Arabia. I think as far as these Western countries are concerned, it would be very important for them to use the leverage that they have over GCC countries, chiefly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to try to sort of rein in their activities in Yemen. And this is going to be important to get to a point where we can have Yemenis talking to Yemenis without so much interference from outside.
Okay. Marwan, if I can take a broader picture angle with you, tell us where, for example, has this type of people's uprising actually succeeded? Where are there some positive role models, arguably, that could be looked to see what can really work in this context?
Well, if you are talking about the Arab region, it's very difficult to find one, except of course for Tunisia, which is now becoming more fragile than it was like a few months ago. But this is exactly for the reasons that I mentioned before. In Tunisia, because it wasn't really very important for the external players. This is why they did not pay much attention actually to what happened there. But if you look everywhere in Egypt, for example, there was external intervention on, support for the military coup in Egypt in 2013. In Syria, I already talked about the war by proxy in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya as well. And of course, I agree that all revolutions are domestic phenomena by nature, but once they happen, actually, they cease to be domestic. They become international, in which the external powers actually try to twist and control and try to steer the course of the revolution in order to make it in their favor or serve their own interests. This applies, of course, to Yemen, to Syria, to Libya, and to other cases. The revolutions start usually because of economic and social problems, domestic problems, but then they become war by proxy, as we have seen in these several cases. In Yemen, the Yemenis, they have absolutely no say today in the war, and if it's up to the Yemenis, they would probably stop the war today. But now it's the Saudis, the Iranians, the Emiratis, and everybody else in the region is actually taking part in this conflict. The revolutions usually turn the countries of the revolution into an arena of conflict between different external powers. This is what happened in Yemen. This is what happened in Syria. This is what's happening right now also in Libya and in other places.
So, I mean, Elisabeth, with Marwan saying there really are no positive examples to follow, I mean, what kind of grim lesson is this? To be careful what you wish for, because bad can get so much worse?
Well, that's certainly one lesson, but I would take a broader lesson out of it, which is a lesson for us. Often, these kinds of uprisings and their very messy aftermaths happen because corrupt regimes have been able to entrench far too long, propped up by Western powers who talk really only about three things: aid, what they're doing about aid; arms sales, how much money they're getting from arms sales; and terrorism, What dangers do we face from terrorism? And they're not really focusing on helping to build institutions, helping to really entrench good education systems, and also injecting true support into the economy at a grassroots level. All of these things could really benefit Yemen. So instead of tiptoeing around the issues of look how much aid we're given, look what a bad crisis it is, but actually tackle the really difficult issues and start to address those.
Right. Giorgio, you know, there's a common tragic issue with most of these conflicts today that you alluded to, in that one can be even overshadowed by another. You know, as the news cycle in particular moves on, Yemen was defined as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but now we're seeing new levels of devastation in Afghanistan and Ethiopia, for example. Is Yemen in danger of, in a sense, being forgotten? And what consequences would that ultimately have?
Yeah, I think that has been happening in recent months, recent years. There has been less attention paid to Yemen. Perhaps one of the few bright sides of this recent escalation of hostilities between the Houthi rebels and Abu Dhabi is going to be more attention paid by the international community. I don't think that's inevitable, but that could potentially be one of the outcomes. And I definitely think it's important to realize that many of the world's superpowers have a role to play here. Again, this is not just about regional powers. There needs to be more action from the permanent members of the UN Security Council to put pressure on different actors involved in Yemen, Yemeni and non-Yemeni actors, to try to actually wind down the war. And without that happening, without the world's superpowers stepping up to take that kind of action, I do fear that these wars in Yemen are going to continue to rage on at the expense of the Yemeni people ultimately.
Marwan, we're down to our last couple of minutes, so I wanted to give you some time for your final thoughts here.
Thank you very much. I think you alluded to the role of the Western countries concerning the Arab Revolution, especially in Yemen. I think the Western countries, especially the United States and also Western European countries, are shooting themselves in the foot by not supporting democratic transition in this part of the world, because they have been actually for many decades supporting authoritarian regimes and not actually lending the needed support for democratic change. Now everybody is complaining about terrorism and refugees in Europe and elsewhere. And I think both actually are the outcome of authoritarianism in this part of the world. If you actually keep actually ignoring the problems of this region and supporting authoritarian regimes and not trying actually to support democratic change, that will actually have a blowback, a very big one perhaps, for Western countries. They will have to deal with the consequences later on. They might think that they are actually immune right now, but then they will discover that this world is becoming really very small place actually, and you can't just ignore issues like Yemen, Syria, Libya, and other running a crisis in this part of the world by favoring either the status quo, by favoring dictators, or by favoring actually conflicts, or thinking that conflicts will remain contained within the borders of the countries that are actually concerned.
Elisabeth, I have a minute left, really, to give you final thoughts. I could see you agreed with much of what Marwan was saying.
Yes, I absolutely do. And I think that tackling those big issues, rather than just always talking about what kind of aid we're giving, is going to go a really long way to helping to, prevent this war from just billowing out of control and spilling over Yemen's borders. I think that Giorgio is also right that that recent developments have really focused attention. So let's hope that the international community can run with that and actually make a difference for Yemenis.
Right. Further destabilization is a danger for everybody, especially, and we haven't even spoken about the remnants of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS or Daesh still being there, not being reined in. But we're going to have to leave it there for now. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Fascinating discussion. And our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.